I have certain beliefs right now that I honestly am questioning that I still think are limited beliefs. But in order for me to change those beliefs, I'm going to have to come out of my resting state, have to step out into the unknown and really check to see and execute in a very different way. Now, to build on that model, then it's going to require 1 foot in the practical world and 1 foot in the mysterious world. Because I can't control all the events that happen in my life, but I can certainly make choices that are going to bring me closer to those experiences. Now, I also know from experience that when I'm living by the hormones of stress and I'm living in survival, that you and I and everybody else is always going to try to control the outcome, to try to force the outcome, to try to get in the way, try to analyze when it's going to happen and how it's going to happen. Now, when that occurs, we're really bad. We're competitive, we're manipulative, we'll hold on to things, we're deceitful, we're greedy, because that's what those chemicals do. So we're always trying to control and force the outcome because, in a sense, we feel separate from something greater. We feel like we're matter trying to change matter. We feel like we're vibrating at the same speed as everything else, and so we have to get what we want, means we have to go and get it. And so then people start mixing spiritual principles with that phenomenon, right? So then that's not what I'm talking about, because I'm talking about if you're able to understand that when you're living by the hormones of stress, that your senses are heightened and that you're a materialist trying to define reality. If you can't see it, feel it, taste it, smell it, it doesn't exist, and you're getting ready for something bad to happen and be prepared and protect yourself, and that's how most people live, then everybody's doing that. Everybody's matter trying to change matter, and sooner or later we're going to bump into each other and there's going to be sparks, right? So then, is it possible then that instead of being defined as a body, living in an environment in a particular time, that if you were to close your eyes and disconnect from the external environment, to sit your body down and to transcend time and to become nobody? You have the biological machinery to do this, to become no one. You're not a face, you're not a man, you're not a documentary filmmaker, you're not your past, you're not your future, you're not a husband, you're not your body, you're not your emotions, you're not your habits, you're not the predictable future or the familiar past. You're pure consciousness. Now, if you are going to heal your body by thought alone, if you are going to create some event in your external environment by thought alone, and if you are going to transcend time by thought alone, then you have to become thought alone. And so when people start to really realize that they can change the neurocircuitry in their brain by thought alone, send new emotional signals that begin to select and upregulate new genes and downregulate other genes, and it may take knocking on that door for extended periods of time till finally the gene is programmed. Because it took them 10 years to program the gene for the disease, it may take them a few years to reprogram the gene. Now we're talking about pragmatist. We're talking about someone who's applying some principles. And so then when that occurs, and the energy that was sitting in these hormonal centers of survival, anger and fear and guilt and shame, the energy kind of moves up a little bit. We've measured this. Heart starts to open, gets more coherent. The field around the body begins to grow. We've measured that. The person feels more like energy, less like matter. They feel like more like wave, less like particle. They're not afraid of the unknown. Mm-hmm. They're craving and they're trusting in the unknown. And that kind of expanded energy is now they're no longer enslaved emotionally to the past. They're no longer an identity that's connected to a disease. They're no longer a body who's addicted to an emotion. They're no longer trying to forecast the future based on the past. They're no longer a man. They're no longer a woman. They're no longer a nurse. They're no longer black. They're no longer white. They're no longer anything. They are completely poised in the present moment. And that present moment produces a liberation of energy because the body is no longer held to the chains of the past. Our genes are as changeable as our brains. The latest research in genetics
shows that different genes are activated at different times. They are always in flux and being influenced. There are experience-dependent genes that are activated when there is growth, healing, or learning. And there are behavioral state-dependent genes that are influenced during stress, emotional arousal, or dreaming. One of the most active areas of research today is epigenetics, literally above genetics, the study of how the environment controls gene activity. Epigenetics flies in the face of the conventional genetic model, which stated that DNA controls all of life and that all gene expression takes place inside the cell. This old understanding doomed us to a predictable future in which our destiny fell prey to our genetic inheritance, and all cellular life was predetermined, like an automatic ghost in the machine. In fact, epigenetic changes in DNA expression can be passed on to future generations. But how do they get passed on if the DNA code stays the same? Let's compare a genetic sequence to a blueprint. Imagine that you start with a blueprint for a house and scan it into your computer. Then, using Photoshop, you could alter its appearance on the screen, changing a number of characteristics without changing the blueprint. For example, you could change the expression of variables such as color, size, scale, dimensions, materials, and so on. Thousands of people representing environmental variables could produce different images, but they would all be expressions of that same blueprint. Epigenetics empowers us to think about change more profoundly. The epigenetic paradigm shift gives us free will to activate our own gene activity and modify our genetic destiny. For the sake of example and simplification, when I talk about activating a gene by expressing it in different ways, I will refer to turning it on. In reality, genes don't turn on or off. They are activated by chemical signals, and they express themselves in specific ways by making various proteins. Just by changing our thoughts, feelings, emotional reactions, and behaviors, for example, making healthier lifestyle choices with regard to nutrition and stress level, we send our cells new signals and they express new proteins without changing the genetic blueprint. So while the DNA code stays the same, once a cell is activated in a new way by new information, the cell can create thousands of variations of the same gene. We can signal our genes to rewrite our future. Just as certain areas of the brain are hardwired, whereas other areas are more plastic, able to be changed by learning and experience. I believe genes are the same way. There are certain parts of our genetics that are more easily turned on, while other genetic sequences are somewhat more hardwired, which means they are harder to activate because they have been around longer in our genetic history. At least that's what science says right now. How do we keep certain genes turned on and others turned off? If we stay in the same toxic state of anger, the same melancholy state of depression, the same vigilant state of anxiety, or the same low state of unworthiness, those redundant chemical signals we have talked about keep pushing the same genetic buttons, which ultimately cause the activation of certain diseases. Stressful emotions, as you will learn, actually pull the genetic trigger dysregulating the cells. Dysregulation refers to impairment of a physiological regulatory mechanism and creating disease. When we think and feel in the same ways for most of our lives and memorize familiar states of being, our internal chemical state keeps activating the same genes, meaning that we keep making the same proteins. But the body cannot adapt to these repeated demands, and it begins to break down. If we do that for 10 or 20 years, the genes begin to wear out and they start making cheaper proteins. What do I mean? Think about what happens when we age. Our skin sags because its collagen and elastin come to be made of cheaper proteins. What happens to our muscles? They atrophy. Well, no surprise there. Actin and myosin 2 are proteins. Here's an analogy. When a metal part for your car is manufactured, it is produced in a die or a mold. Each time that mold or die is used, it is subjected to certain forces, including heat and friction, which begin to wear it down. As you might guess, car parts are built to very close tolerances, referring to the permitted variation in a workpiece's dimensions. Over time, that die or mold wears to the point that it produces parts that won't fit properly to other parts. This is similar to what happens to the body. As a result of stress or a habit of being repeatedly and consistently angry, fearful, sad, and so on, the DNA that the peptides use to produce proteins will start to malfunction. What is the genetic impact if we stay in routine, familiar conditions, creating the same emotional reactions by doing the same things, thinking the same thoughts, seeing the same people, and memorizing our lives into a predictable pattern? We are now headed for an undesirable genetic destiny. We are locked into the same patterns as generations before us, which confronted the same or similar situations. And if we are only reliving our emotional memories of the past, then we are headed for a predictable end. Our bodies will begin to create the same genetic conditions that previous generations faced. Thus, the body will stay the same as long as we are feeling the same way, day in and day out. And if science tells us that it is the environment that signals the genes involved in evolution, what if our environment never changes? What if we've memorized the same conditions in our outer world and we're living by the same thoughts, behaviors, and feelings? What if everything in our lives stays the same? So if the experiences in your life aren't changing, the chemical signals going to your genes aren't changing. No new information from the outer world is reaching your cells. The quantum model asserts that we can signal the body emotionally and begin to alter a chain of genetic events without first having any actual physical experience that correlates to that emotion. We don't need to win the race, the lottery, or the promotion before we experience the emotions of those events. Remember, we can create an emotion by thought alone. We can experience joy or gratitude ahead of the environment to such an extent that the body begins to believe that it is already in that event. As a result, we can signal our genes to make new proteins, to change our bodies, to be ahead of the present environment. Here's an example of how we can signal new genes in new ways when we begin to emotionally embrace an event in the future before it is made manifest. In Japan, a study was conducted to find out what effect one's state of mind might have on disease. The subjects were two groups of patients with type 2 diabetes, all of whom were dependent on insulin. Keep in mind that most diabetics medicate with insulin to remove sugar, glucose out of the bloodstream and deposit it in the cells where it can be used for energy. At the time of this study, the people involved were being treated with insulin pills or injections to help control their elevated blood sugar levels. Each group had their fasting blood sugar level tested to establish a baseline. Next, one set of subjects watched a comedy show for an hour while the control group watched a boring lecture. The test subjects then ate a delicious meal, after which their blood glucose levels were checked again. There was a significant discrepancy between the subjects who enjoyed the comedy show and those who viewed the uneventful lecture. On average, those who watched the lecture had their blood sugar levels rise high enough that they would need to take insulin to keep themselves out of the danger zone. In the joyful group who had laughed for 1 hour, their after dinner blood sugar values rose about half that amount, slightly outside of normal range. Initially, the researchers who performed the experiment thought that the lighthearted subjects had lowered their sugar levels by contracting their abdominal and diaphragm muscles when they laugh. They reasoned that when a muscle contracts, it uses energy, and circulating energy is glucose. But the research went further. They examined the gene sequences of the jovial individuals and discovered that these diabetics had altered 23 different gene expressions just by laughing at the comedy show they'd seen. Their elevated state of mind apparently triggered their brains to send new signals to their cells, which turned on those genetic variations that allowed their bodies to naturally begin to regulate the genes responsible for processing blood sugar. Our emotions can turn on some gene sequences and turn off others. This study clearly showed. Just by signaling the body with a new emotion, the laughing subjects altered their internal chemistry to change the expression of their genes. Sometimes, a change in genetic expression can be sudden and dramatic. Have you ever heard of people, after being subjected to extremely stressful conditions, whose hair turned gray overnight? That's an example of genes at work. They experienced such a strong emotional reaction that their altered body chemistry both turned on the gene for the expression of gray hair and shut off the genetic expression for their normal hair color within a matter of hours. They signaled new genes in new ways by emotionally and thus chemically altering their internal environment. When you've experienced an event numerous times by mentally rehearsing every aspect of it in your mind, you feel what that event would feel like before it unfolds. Then as you change the circuitry in your brain by thinking in new ways, and you embrace the emotions of an event ahead of its physical manifestation, it's possible that you can change your body genetically. Can you pick a potential from the quantum field? Every potential already exists, by the way, and emotionally embrace a future event before the actual experience. Can you do this so many times that you emotionally condition the body to a new mind, thus signaling new genes in new ways? If you can, it is highly possible that you will begin to shape and mold your brain and body into a new expression, so that they physically change before the desired potential reality is made manifest.